Alright, for this video I'm going to demonstrate how vacuum bagging is used to make the composite skin of this vertical stabilizer. And to start, we've got this mold here that serves as the right skin for the vertical. And we'll cover in later videos how to make molds, but for now we're just going to go ahead and use this. So the first thing to do is to clean this mold. You got to start with is by cleaning off the excess epoxy with just a standard razor blade here. And you just got to be kind of careful you don't scrape off the too much wax on the mold, because this is a pretty well seasoned mold. You won't have to wax it very much, but you do want to scrape off this extra epoxy from whoever last used the mold. And it's important to do this every single time you use the mold, because there's always some excess epoxy left from the previous layup. Alright, once that's done, kind of just get that dust off there. And just grab yourself a paper towel here, a little bit of alcohol to clean off the rest of the dust and whatever previous markings somebody made on here. Alright, so now that that's done, we are going to mark using silver Sharpie, there it is, where we are to lay the fibers, just to kind of guide us so we get the fibers in the correct spot and don't fall short of what we need. So we're just going to lay the piece we already have in here to give us an idea of where those fibers need to extend to at a minimum. Now the router here is not made out of fiberglass. That's made separately. It used to be made using this mold, that's why it's so big. But since then, we've tried other things that work better. So I'm just going to go ahead and mark where that needs to go. Draw a line. Now we've just got a rough outline of where the fiberglass needs to lay. And now, since this is such a well-seasoned mold, we are just going to use this spray-on mold release. We're just going to give it a quick spray. The reason we do this before marking with the Sharpie, we mark with the Sharpie before we spray this, is the Sharpie won't really mark once it's waxed. So just get a nice and that should dry in about a minute, and then we are ready to go. Alright, so one unique feature about this piece is that it has to be somewhat stiff so the air doesn't just crush it, a really thin fiberglass shell. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this really lightweight foam called Rosil, and we're going to sandwich it between two layers of fiberglass to add that extra rigidity to the surface. So I have marked out on here the size it's supposed to be. You can kind of see here, got it labeled on here like what sizes it is. It's hard to kind of tell, but if you kind of look at this outline here, you can see where the Rosil goes. And all it does is it makes it so that when you press here, it doesn't really flex that much. So that's what we're going for. And you can just cut this stuff with an X-Acto knife. That's the best way to do it. So we're going to get this cut out here real quick, and then we're going to have to bevel the edges in order to let the fiberglass actually contour to the shape. Alright, so now I've got this shape cut out here, and this foam is 1 millimeter thick, which is very thin, but we still want to take these edges down and give them a nice, about 45 degree, maybe 30 degree bevel. to allow the fiberglass to fully contour around it and not give us any air bubbles. So just got a sanding block here with 120 grit sandpaper, which is sufficient for this thin stuff. You may have to go with like 80 grit for it if it's thicker. And sometimes people like to make marks so that you know what you've sanded and what you haven't. But this is a relatively small piece, so we're just going to go for it. And you want to be somewhat gentle with it because the edges of the sanding block here will actually catch the foam and rip it to shreds if you're not careful. And then you have to cut another piece. And this stuff is not cheap, so you don't want to do that. Just going to give this stuff a light butter. You know the bevel's pretty good when the leading edge of it starts to kind of become uneven, which is not something you want, but you know that you get your edge really, really, really thin when it starts to do that. So that's when you stop. And you want to do this on all 4 sides. Alright, that'll do it for those 4 edges. Now if you can kind of see, let me see if I can get the camera to focus in on this here. It might not want to, it's having a little bit of trouble seeing it here. Yeah, you can see that this edge here is nice and thin, really, really brittle. So you just want to be careful. Yeah, so this piece is all ready to go. Okay, so I've actually already cut the fiberglass here. It's a bit of a trivial matter. But I've got 3 layers. And they're just slightly bigger than what we need. We don't want to put too much to waste. So got a little about like that. That'll be good. And so we'll set these aside. And we've already cut some breather. And I have 2 layers of breather with an additional layer on the back, which we'll talk about later. So now, with the Rosil cut and the fiberglass cut, we're ready to go ahead and mix up some epoxy and get this thing started. So I've already got 75 grams of our standard laminated resin in here that we just need to go ahead and mix in the hardener. And this is, again, a 40 to 100 ratio, so we're going to go ahead and add 30 grams of this. Mix this up nice and thoroughly. Get ready to go. Alright, so we've got our epoxy all mixed up. Ready to go. Let's go ahead and wet out the first piece. Now you may be wondering, I said earlier we're going to sandwich this Rosil foam in between the fiberglass, but we only have 3 layers of fiberglass. Well, we want 2 layers to be on the outside of the vertical to help with the not getting dented with handling. And then the single layer can be on the inside since that's not going to be exposed to the elements and various other handling and transportation damages. So we can go ahead and get this relatively dry considering there's going to be 2 layers. And the other thing about Rosil is when you use it along with vacuum bagging, you cannot pull the epoxy out of the fabric through the Rosil. So you want these pieces to be as dry as possible because then you're just adding excess weight that you don't really need usually. So this part is a little less trivial than the previous parts that I have shown due to its a little bit more complicated contours. But we'll get through that here. So I'm just laying this piece on here, getting it laid down, make sure there's no dirt or any other things covering your mold. Oops. Alright. So we'll bring the camera in closer so you can kind of see what's going on here. But we've got kind of the fabric doesn't really want to fit into the corners here, so we're going to have to do some cutting in order to get it to fit. So let me bring the camera over here and get a better view of how exactly we're going to do this. Alright, so you can see here that you can see little bubbles and stuff that you just need to work out. Those are no big deal for right now. Up here, the fabric doesn't really want to lay in that corner, and we want a nice flush fit with this. And so we're going to have to do some cutting. So we're just going to take an old pair of epoxy scissors. You don't want to destroy some nice scissors. And what you can see is right here, the fabric is trying to wrinkle, so we'll just go ahead and cut that. Now, yeah, this somewhat affects the strength, but it's just right here at the top. You're not really going to notice it that much, so it's really not that big a deal. So we're just going to go ahead and cut this kind of in a fan pattern here, which will help it to, well, let's trim off some of this excess first. Alright. So we'll continue to cut this in a little bit of a fan pattern here. Should help us a lot with getting this in here. Alright. Now we want to leave a little bit of excess here so we can fold it down and have it stick, so it's not in our way. So now what we've got is the fabric. It's a little more behaving toward fitting in that corner. Now, what you can do is, see, I'm having a little bit of trouble getting it to stay down, is we can take a little bit of our epoxy here, just put it on a finger here, just kind of put it in that corner. See how much that helped there? And yeah, of course, that's adding weight, but sometimes you don't really care and it's really not that much, so you just deal with it. So lay all that stuff down, especially if it's up here and it's just kind of getting in your way. And you don't have to get this part perfect for right now because, of course, we're going to be adding another layer, which is going to cause more problems. So just kind of smooth that out for now, and that'll be good enough for now, I guess. Make sure there's no wrinkles. Wrinkles are what really kills it. Alright, so set this aside, and we'll go ahead and wet out another piece here. Now, one thing I kind of forgot to talk about is the vertical that I was showing you earlier in the video was actually black. And the way we get it to be black like that is adding pigment to the epoxy. But because this is just a demo, we don't really care to do that for right now. So, okay. So, there's our second piece. Now, you really want to be careful. Try and lay it exactly where you want it the first time, which I just failed to do. Because if you press it down and then go to peel it back up, it's going to peel up your previous layer too, and then that's just frustrating. So we don't want to do that. Just want to, it's all pressed down here. Now you can see it's kind of splotchy looking. That's just because I can like really press those out, but it's really not that big a deal because the vacuum's just going to go ahead and do that anyway. so I'm not going to bother. So we're going to go ahead and proceed again to cutting these in like a fan pattern here. Get it to fit down in there. Cut that little extra piece out there. All right. Okay, now you can see that there's a considerable like leading edge bubble here. We'll take care of that later. It's not really anything to worry about at this time. And trust me, vacuum bagging it will help a lot to get rid of those bubbles. As long as you do it right. Alright, so now it's time for the roseau. It's actually very simple. You just take the roseau, and sometimes if it's kind of a curved part, you can take a heat iron to this and kind of flex it, and it'll somewhat hold its shape. But this isn't really a curved surface, so I'm just going to go ahead and lay it in here. Eyeball it or measure it or whatever you need to do. And actually, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to go get like 2 drops of epoxy here. Just kind of put it on the bottom, just so it doesn't move around so much when we're trying to put the other layer on, even though it still seems to be moving around. So that'll do for that. Set that aside and get our last piece of epoxy right out of it. Yeah, it looks like I mixed a little extra epoxy on this one, no big deal. Get rid of this. Straighten this. Alright, our very last piece. Now it's kind of bad practice here, me laying the mold directly on top of this wet table, but it's kind of hard to just keep moving the video camera around, so I'm just going to have to wipe it off when we're done. Alright, so just like all the other layers, be careful when you lay it down so you don't have to peel it back up. And we'll have to go ahead and cut the same fan pattern right where the fabric is folding. You can imagine this would get pretty annoying if you had to do 20 layers or something like that. That's why we usually use carbon fiber, because you usually don't have to cut for things like that. But in this instance, the antenna is actually embedded inside of this vertical, so we have to use fiberglass to prevent any RF interference. Alright, so we can go ahead and cut off some of this excess since we don't really need it. So now we have our piece all covered in fiberglass, and notice it didn't really stick to the roseau. You just kind of have to deal with it. Not much we can do about that. So now it's time for the release, which some say is the most important part, and I tend to agree. So go ahead and do that next. Alright, so now we have got our piece ready to put the release on, and we're going to have to do the same thing with the release as we did with the fiberglass, except even more so because the release is not flexible at all. So let's go ahead and do that. So, get ourselves a nice clean pair of scissors, well, somewhat clean I guess. And we're going to go ahead and press this into the corner here. And you can see where the wrinkles are forming. There's a nice one forming right there. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut. So I'll press it down in there. Now I got another one forming right there. Same thing. You want to be careful not to cut your fiberglass like I'm doing right now. Okay, there we go. Put that in there. Then you can see more wrinkles form as you press it in there. That's fine. Just keep going at it. This stuff is basically not flexible whatsoever. So we've just got to make tons of cuts. Alright, so then we'll make one final one at the end here. So that piece can fold down. There we go. Alright. Now we don't need... Oh, yeah, I'm scared of this excess here that I forgot to take off. Okay, we don't need all this excess here. It's just kind of getting on our way, so just cut this off. Alright. So now we have a few more cuts to go along here, and we'll be ready to go. Remember, it's very, very, very worth taking your time on this, because when the vacuum goes to press against this, if it presses and it can't get into that little corner, what it'll do is it'll just bridge that gap, and you'll end up getting a nice either bubble or a big epoxy spot or something that you do not want on your mold. If that's if you're unlucky. Well, no, that pretty much always happens actually. So, just got to be careful and take your time. Alright, so as you can see, this really fills in nice and good in there. You can even actually see the epoxy soaking through, which is good. Of course, you put a lot of epoxy, that's probably why we see it. But alright, so now what we've got here is we've got our breather cut oversized, covers the entire piece. And what we're going to do first is set the entire thing on one of the pieces of breathing. And the reason we do this is to get even pressure on both sides of the mold to kind of give it a nice compression. So, now that we did that, we've got two more layers stacked together here. I'm just going to go ahead and lay those right on top here. You gotta be careful not to bend your release over. In the corners. Don't shift it around too much. Alright, it's good to go now. So, one last step. Well, not one. I guess there's a few more steps. This is the important one. Do not want to forget about putting the bottom of your vacuum pump nozzle on this. What we're going to do is we're going to set it here. I'm going to show you. This is the flat part where there's no actual fiberglass or anything. We're going to set that right there. Now we're lucky enough on this mold to have that spot. Sometimes we don't have it, so what we end up having to do is have excess of the breather come off of the mold, and then we just put the piece on there, which works fine, but in this case it's convenient. So, alright, now that we have this piece all ready to go, we have our vacuum bag here, which is just like a nylon bag by most composite stores. It's plenty oversized, make it easier to work with. What we've got here is just basically a little seal for the vacuum pump that uses, oh, is it going to focus? Maybe? Maybe not. Oh, come on. Oh, what the fuck? So, this is the seal. It basically is just a little piece of nylon inside another nylon tube. What we're going to do is we peel that back, put the bag right inside here, and then press it closed, and that makes an airtight seal. So that's what we're going to use. So what I like to do first, this is a relatively small piece, so it's not that big a deal to handle. But go ahead and take this all the way off. We'll set our mold aside here just for a second. I like to go ahead and seal up one end of the bag first, make things a little easier on ourselves. So what you do is you grab some sort of weight, hammer, whatever. In this case, I forgot to bring a hammer, so I'm just going to go ahead and use weight. You start at one end. The goal of this is to not get any wrinkles. You don't want any wrinkles, so those leak air. So then you take this hammer, You get that white thing all the way into this line. And then you can turn it to the side, and as long as you don't see any white, you're good. You got that white thing all the way in, airtight seal. So now we got that. We'll go ahead and flip this over here. Make sure breather covers on all sides. Sometimes it's kind of nice to have an extra hand for this, but a small piece that we do. Just throw a piece inside here. We're good to go. And then make sure you put the little vacuum thing in there. You don't want to have to go back and redo all this again. So then we grab the other bag clamp and do the same thing. We're going to seal this side up too. Now on bigger parts, you will want plenty of extra bag so you can get it into the creases and such. But this is basically a flat piece, so we're not really too concerned with that. So that'll do it for that. Now, it's time to attach the vacuum pump. Go ahead and take your X-Acto knife and cut out the shape of the vacuum pump nozzle thing. Now, this being a bag, you want to be careful if it's laying also on the other side of the bag that you don't cut through both sides. Because then you're screwed and you kind of have to just get another one. So we don't want to be doing that. Piece. We grab our vacuum pump. Nozzle. Here on the table. We've got our nozzle here. Go ahead and attach that. Snug it down nice and good. Okay. Alright, didn't mean to turn that up. That's okay. So, first what I'm going to do is remove the excess air out of the bag so that we get somewhat of a snug feel to it. So I'm going to do that real quick. Alright, so now is a very important part. Okay, the goal here is, you can see this is somewhat snug. In fact, actually that's a little too much. We're going to have to take some of that air out. Nice thing about having a quick connect nozzle here. So, what we've got to do, just more slack on this thing, I have to kind of hold that up, is you can kind of see the outline here of the vertical. And what we're going to have to do, in order to get the vacuum to press that composite into that corner and not give us any air bubbles, we have to go ahead and crease the bag, is what we call it usually. Which basically, anytime there's a contour, which in this case there's only really one leading edge, we're going to go ahead and put like a wrinkle in the bag, as you could call it. And they don't have to look nice, they just need to actually let the bag go into that corner as the air gets sucked out. Otherwise, it'll just bridge that gap and we won't get a nice finish on that. So we're going to turn on the pump and see what this does. You can see I kind of missed with that up here. It didn't really get in there. So we're just going to have to let the air back out here. Move that crease. And there we go. Now it's sucked into that corner. That's good. Now what you can do to make sure that it got in there is you can go around and press with your fingers up against it. And if it presses in, then you didn't get all the way in the corner. That's better than good. So I need a little bit more bag right in here. And right in there you can kind of see how it presses in. I'm going to turn this off real quick so you can hear there's no hissing. That's good. That means we don't have any leaks. Nonetheless, we're still going to run the pump all night. So, just as a recap before I run out of memory, we covered how to make a composite skin using the vacuum pump, and also covered the use of Roasil in stiffening the composite. And that's it for this video. We'll come back in about 24 hours and see how this turned out.